Hello, this is Fiona, and I am studying for CMA Exam Part 2. And just a reminder, I'm making these videos for me, myself, and I. I'm not trying to get famous or make money. I literally am just recording this and posting this, so that way I can listen to it while I sleep or drive. And I'm just making it public just in case it's helpful for someone else studying for the CMA. Okay? So I'm going to start with Unit 10 here. All right, so economic profit. That equals revenues minus economic costs. And economic costs are direct costs and the opportunity cost of capital. So economic profit is revenues minus direct costs minus the opportunity cost of capital. Where direct costs are just like those normal costs, like variable, fixed, things like that. So the only difference between economic profit and accounting profit is just also including opportunity costs. You can also calculate economic profit by net income minus parentheses equities times the imputed interest percentage. Let's see. But going back to that original formula, revenues minus economic costs, just remember that explicit costs require actual cash disbursements, but implicit costs are opportunity costs. So economic profit just includes those implicit costs into the profit equation. So it's a much more conservative measure of profit than accounting profit. Total cost. That equals variable costs at that particular production level plus the total fixed costs. That's pretty simple. Relevant costs for components. That is all avoidable costs. So that would be like variable manufacturing costs, direct materials, direct labor, variable manufacturing overhead, as well as avoidable fixed costs. So generally for avoidable fixed costs, they would say in the question like, these are fixed marketing costs, but if we eliminated this product, we would eliminate 30% of that fixed marketing cost, for example. Things relevant for special orders. That depends on if there's capacity available for that special order or not. So if capacity is available, things that would be relevant to the decision whether to do the special order or not are variable costs, avoidable fixed costs, and the opportunity cost of the next best use of that available capacity. If capacity is not available currently to do that special order, then things that are relevant to that decision are variable costs, avoidable fixed costs, the opportunity cost of the lost contribution margin in order to gain capacity, and unavoidable fixed costs are also relevant. So if you have available capacity, the opportunity cost that's like there is just what you would miss out on if you you have 10,000, like your machine can make 10,000 more units a year to do that special order. Maybe it's $35 times each of those 10,000 units. That's great. But if you take that special order, maybe you're missing out on one that's $55 each for 10,000 units. So that's what the opportunity cost there. But if you don't have capacity, that means you're already making the full, $50,000 that machine could make, including that, if capacity was available portion of 10,000. There's nothing, right? Like, you're going to have to get rid of some units or maybe just like a whole other order you originally normally do in order to take on this new order or this opportunity. So the opportunity cost there, if capacity is not available, is the opportunity cost of the lost contribution margin you give up in order to gain capacity for that special order. So, there are some, it's a lot of the same kind of things if capacity is available or not. Like, variable costs and avoidable fixed costs, are both relevant to, if it's available or not. There's an opportunity cost involved. But if capacity is not available, a relevant cost would also be unavoidable fixed costs. If there's capacity available, then unavoidable fixed costs, they're unavoidable. They're already sunk. We don't care about them. But if capacity is not available, then they are relevant. Now, the decision to make something in-house versus outsource the production. You should make it in-house when the total cost of production is less than the cost to buy. You should outsource it when the total cost of production is greater than the cost to buy. incremental costs of a special order. That equals special units, the number of special units times the variable cost per unit, plus special units times fixed costs per unit, all minus normal total cost. All right, so special unit, like the total variable cost of the special order plus the total fixed cost of the special order minus the normal total cost. And remember, normal total cost was variable costs plus total fixed costs. Differential costs. This is the minimum price per unit. So differential costs, those are the direct materials per unit, the direct labor per unit, the variable manufacturing overhead per unit, plus the variable selling costs per unit. So everything variable, everything avoidable, that's not fixed. And so when you add all the things together, that's your minimum price per unit, because that is, the contribution margin of the variable costs of the unit. So like, in order to break even, if we're ignoring fixed costs right now, that's where you need to break even. So that's the minimum price per unit that you should have. You can also calculate differential costs by also doing the incremental cost of the order divided by units order. Incremental cost is the same as marginal cost. That's that how much more it costs to sell one more unit, right? So the incremental cost of that order, so doing that one more order divided by units ordered, also gives you the differential costs. Profits are maximized when marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? So that how much more you'll make if you sell one more unit, that difference between X units sold and X plus 1 unit sold, when that equals marginal cost, so the cost of X units minus X plus 1 units, when those are the same, that's when profits are maximized, especially when you're in a perfectly competitive market. Now the marginal cost of X units, that's the total cost for X units times X units minus the total cost for X minus 1 units times X minus 1 units. So kind of like what I said before. Marginal analysis, also known as incremental analysis. If the marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, you should process that item further. If the incremental marginal revenue is less than incremental marginal cost, you should sell that item as is. And if marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue, you should probably also think about disinvesting in that product line. Okay. Marginal analysis continued, i.e. incremental analysis. You should keep the product line if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. So if you get more for selling an additional unit than it takes to make that additional unit, then you should keep that product line. But you should also keep that product line if operating income will go down if the product line was eliminated. That's another way to tell. You should drop the product line if marginal revenue is less than marginal cost. Another way to tell that you should drop it is if operating income would increase if that product line was eliminated. Joint costs. Like I said in a previous video, these are irrelevant at the split off point. And the split off point is deciding whether to sell or continue to develop that product. So joint costs are costs incurred until the split off point, and those include direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. And it's kind of called joint costs because these might be spread across like a few products that are made pretty similarly, right? Like if you're making a screw that has this type of head and a screw that has this type of head, the process and the manufacturing is probably pretty similar, so those costs are kind of shared until the split off point when you decide if you're going to sell each screw as is or develop it further. Separable costs. These are identified with a particular joint product and are allocated to a specific unit of output. Separable costs, so that's like it's let's see. So I'm buying a desk chair bundle. Obviously there's different costs that go into that, like, the screws and everything, and it's going to be hard to identify like how much each screw cost going into building this desk. But for the desk chair bundle, you could separate the cost of the desk from the cost of the bundle in terms of the manufacturer, right? So that's what that means. Average total cost, also known as ATC. So average total cost equals numerator, fixed cost plus the variable cost at a given production level, all over output at that production level. Again, average total cost, it's like the average of the total cost, which before we said total cost was the variable cost at a given production level plus fixed costs. And average, you're just dividing by that output, right? So average total cost is the variable cost at that given production level plus fixed costs divided by output at that production level. Keep or drop, different. So instead of the incremental approach, we're looking at the income statement approach. And there's 4 steps for this. So you're going to add or subtract the impact to sales if that product line was eliminated. Add or subtract the proportional impact to variable expenses, right? So if sales would decrease by 67% if the product line was eliminated, variable costs would also decrease by 67%. And finally, you're going to subtract fixed expenses because if you associated with that product line, because if you eliminate that product line, you eliminate those fixed costs. So you're subtracting that because it's you're saving, right? So you're gonna, plus or minus the impact of sales if eliminated, plus or minus the proportional impact from sales to variable expenses, minus the fixed expenses that were associated with that product line, and that will equal the new operating income. So operating income, that's what you're getting at, and that's the income statement approach. But the incremental approach, you're still kind of doing the same thing, but it's different. So you're going to subtract the lost contribution margin that will be eliminated with the product line. So if you made $10 total, if you eliminate that product line, you're not going to be getting $10 anymore. So you're going to subtract that, but you're going to add back the variable expenses eliminated with that product line. And then you're going to subtract the lost revenue eliminated with the product line. Okay. And so now for step 2, you're going to plus or minus the impact to sales if applicable. And if there's an impact to sales, then you're going to plus or minus the proportional variable expenses. And this is Calypso. And third step, you're going to add fixed cost savings. Those are avoidable fixed costs eliminated with X. So the incremental approach is finding the change in operating income. So the income statement approach was finding the new operating income. But the incremental approach is seeing that difference in operating income if you eliminate that product line. And that's step 1, plus or minus step 2, plus step 3. So that's that. Subtract that lost contribution margin eliminated with that product line. Add the variable expenses eliminated with it. Subtract the lost revenue eliminated with it. Plus or minus impact to sales and proportionally variable expenses, and you're going to add those fixed cost savings. All right, on to Unit 11, the midpoint formula. That is the absolute value of Q1 minus Q2 all over Q1 plus Q2 divided by 2. So let me say that again. The numerator is absolute value of Q1 minus Q2. The denominator is Q1 plus Q2 divided by 2. And so you could, we have a fraction in the denominator, so let's flip it around. We have the absolute value of Q1 minus Q2 times 2 over Q1 plus Q2. Okay. Price elasticity of demand. So it takes that midpoint formula and puts it on crack. Okay, so price elasticity of demand, that's represented as ED, big E, little d. So that's that absolute value of Q1 minus Q2 over Q1 plus Q2 divided by 2, divided by absolute value of P1 minus P2 over P1 plus P2 divided by 2. And remember, Q and P, that's the quantity demanded, and the price is the price at that quantity. So let's break this formula down a bit more, because if you're going to divide with a fraction and you've got fractions in the denominator, it's worth just going ahead and breaking this down. So when we get rid of that dividing sign, flip and switch to the multiply, we have absolute value of Q1 minus Q2 over Q1 plus Q2 over 2 times P1 plus P2 over 2 divided by the absolute value of P1 minus P2. But we still have some fractions going on, right? So what we're going to do is deal with those. So what we actually have then is 2 times the absolute value of Q1 minus Q2 all over Q1 plus Q2 times P1 plus P2 all over 2 times the absolute value of P1 minus P2. And so those 2's will cancel out, and so then you're just left with absolute value of Q1 minus Q2 times P1 plus P2 all over, parentheses, Q1 plus Q2, parentheses, times absolute value of P1 minus P2. You could also find the price elasticity of demand, again, that's ED, big E, little d, as the percent change in quantity demanded over the percent change, the percent change in price. So that's basically what we just explained using the midpoint formula on crack. So, but to continue with price elasticity of demand, if ED is greater than 1, then demand is relatively elastic. So that means if there's a small change in price, there will be a big change in quantity demanded. If ED equals 1, then there's unitary elasticity within a limited range of quantity. And unitary elasticity means each 1 unit change in price will yield 1 unit change in quantity demanded. If ED is less than 1, then we have relatively inelastic demands. That means if there's even a large change in price, there's still going to be an insignificant change in quantity demanded. If ED is infinity, we have perfectly elastic demand, and that happens when the market is pure competition. One firm cannot change the price. If ED equals 0, we have perfectly inelastic demand, so quantity demanded is fixed, so that means the price can go very high, and that generally happens more so in a monopoly, right? Because if you can only sell so many products, in order to, make the big bucks, you're going to have to increase the price by a lot. I kind of hinted at it there, but let's talk about pure competition. It happens when there's a homogeneous standardized product. So think of the market for pencils, or specifically wooden pencils, right? It's like a wooden pencil is a wooden pencil. Does it matter the brand? Yeah, you're just going to buy whatever's cheapest, probably. It's there's a large number of buyers and sellers, and there's perfectly elastic demand. Here, in a purely competitive market, the marginal revenue is going to equal the price. In a monopoly, however, there's one firm, one product with no close substitutes. Here, the marginal revenue will be less than the price. To increase sales in a monopoly, you'll generally have to lower the price, which will lead to a decrease in marginal revenue as output will decrease. Because if you're selling your product for less, you're not going to want to sell as much of the product because you feel like you're wasting your product. All right, the product life cycle. There's 5 stages. There's pre-commercialization, so like research and development, R&D. Then there's introduction to the market. Then there's growth of that product. Then maturity, and then decline. That's the end of Unit 11. Let's do Unit 12. This is the last unit I have cards for at the moment. So let's get this done. Operational risks. These are related to an organization's ongoing everyday operations. So operational risk, risks of operating. So this is the risk of loss from inadequate or failed internal processes, people, or systems. The frequency severity matrix. So we have severity horizontal, and we have severity as the columns, frequency as the rows. So if frequency and severity are both low, then you have risk retention. And I'm going to talk about what these are in a second. If severity is low, frequency is high, you have risk reduction or risk retention. If severity is high, frequency low, you have risk sharing. And if severity and frequency are both high, you have risk avoidance. And I'm going to revisit this matrix once I talk about what those were that I just said. So risk avoidance versus risk retention. Risk avoidance ends the activity where the risk arises. So for example, the best way to avoid the risks of skydiving are to just not skydive. Risk retention is the organization's acceptance of the risk of an activity. So, like using the internet, for example, basically any business now, like the benefits of using the internet far outweigh the risk of getting hacked. So you just kind of accept that risk and try to mitigate it, but still like just move on. Risk exploitation. That's the deliberate courting of risk in order to pursue a high return on investment. So that an example of that would be a risky stock or gambling. So again, the deliberate, I'm going to go for this risk because high risk, high reward, baby. Finally, risk reduction, mitigation versus risk sharing transfer. Risk reduction or mitigation, that's the act of lowering risk. So you would use probably controls in order to do that. But risk sharing or transfers some of the potential loss to another party. And examples of that are insurance, hedging, or outsourcing an activity in general. Okay, so let's revisit that severity matrix. If severity is low, frequency is low, you'll have risk retention, which is the organization's acceptance of the risk of an activity. If severity is low, frequency is high, you have risk reduction, which is the act of lowering risk. Or you'll have risk retention, which is, again, organization's acceptance of the risk of an activity. If severity is high, frequency is low, you have risk sharing, which transfers some of the potential loss to another party. And finally, if you have high severity, high frequency, you have risk avoidance, and that will end the activity where the risk arises. Okay, so I'm going to just reordering my cards for the next time. Okay, some types of risks. Hazard risks. These are insurable risks, so a hazard. Examples of that: natural disasters, sabotage, terrorism, or incapacity or death of senior officers. Strategic risks. These include global economic risk, political risk, because governments will change rules. Regulatory risks, risks related to global market conditions. So if a war starts, it's going to impact strategy. Reputation risk, leadership risk, brand risk, changing consumer needs. Now, what's the difference between a residual risk and an inherent risk? We talked about controls earlier. That's where they'll come into play. So residual risk is the risk of an activity remaining after effects of any risk responses or controls. So residual, what remains? What's going to remain after you put controls in place? Inherent risk is the risk of an activity that arises from the activity itself, regardless of if there are controls in place or not, right? Like, skydiving, risky. You can reduce that risk with the control of a parachute, but there's always still that residual risk of what if the parachute fails and then you plummet. Risk inventory. That's all identified risks that affect strategy and business objectives. There's 5 key steps in the risk management process. You identify risks, assess risks, prioritize risks, formulate risk responses, and then after you put those in place, you monitor the risk responses. Enterprise risk management, also known as ERM. It's the culture, capabilities, and practices integrated with strategy setting and performance that organizations rely on to manage risk in creating, preserving, and realizing value. Let me say that again. Enterprise risk management, ERM, is the culture, capabilities, and practices integrated with strategy setting and performance that organizations rely on to manage risk while creating, preserving, and realizing value. And there's 5 interrelated components of the COSO ERM framework, which are split into 2 different categories. So there's 2 in this first category of supporting aspect components, and then 3 in the common process components. So the 2 in the supporting aspect components are governance and culture, and then information, communication, and reporting. Then, in the common process components, we have strategy and objective setting, performance, and review and revision. Thank you.